Hi everyone, welcome. We're about to start. Oh, fantastic! Looks like a great number of you have come for this. I'm gonna introduce our speaker in just a moment. So, folks, a quick thing before we start. If you look to the right of your screen, there is a panel called Q&A. As you listen to our speaker, Tejas, you listen to him and you have any thoughts, please put those questions in there so that we can filter them and pass them on to the speaker. Okay, I think we're on time. Let's get to it. So, welcome to the first day of the design track of IGDC 2021. I hope you can all hear me. Before we begin, we're very excited to bring this track to you this year. We'd like to just thank all our sponsors who made IGTC happen. So our presenting sponsor is Unreal Engine. Our gold sponsors are MPL, Amazon Web Services, Glance, and Jungly. Our legacy silver sponsors are Gamation, Lakshya, and YesNome, along with bronze sponsors Quali and Gameon. Our hyper casual track, which is a special track that we've built this year, is by the Succeed Innovation Fund. All right, so let me tell you a bit about the talk that we have and about our speaker. So Teja Souza, in his own words, has recently unlocked the Decade Badge as a game dev. He's been around the block, mostly in an effort to attain more badges. He's earned the Indie, Mobile, and AAA badges and hopes that the coming years will give him more. He continues to live under the delusion that there's an elite four somewhere who he has to challenge to excel off because he likes Microsoft Excel and continues to strive for excellence. And on that funny note, he'll be talking to us today about his learnings from playing and designing board games and how they inform his work in, well, video gaming. So this is Cardboard Callouts, and I'm going to go away. Let's have they just come on stage.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello. Am I audible? Okay, good. I got one message that says I'm audible, so that's great. Right, let's begin. Right, so this talk is called Cardboard Callouts, and it's all about lessons that I've learned from playing and making board games. So, my name is Teja Souza. I am currently a senior game designer at Double 11. I'm also a hobbyist board game maker. Generally don't share it, but I like to make them for myself and for my friends. And over the last 10 years, I've worked at this array of companies, working on everything from indie to mobile to double AAA. I've also worked on a bunch of different platforms. So I've kind of bounced around quite a bit. But before we kind of get into the meat of today's talk, let me just tell you, or show you rather, a video a bit to explain what Double 11 is and what we do. Right. So, to the meat of the topic. Today I'm going to be discussing four things. First, fantasy fulfillment. Second, action economy and headspace. Then we're going to talk about downtime or wait time, depending on what nomenclature you like. and finally, scaling and variance. So let's start with fantasy fulfillment. Now, the player fantasy is kind of what the player is going to feel like when they're playing your game, right? As a designer, it's kind of what you're telling the player to expect from your game. It's kind of like you're creating a promise, you're setting expectations, and the rest of it is you figuring out how to meet those expectations and ensure that what you've promised is achieved. Now, when you look at any type of media, there's everything has a very unique sort of fantasy that it provides. It's very clear from the aesthetic to how it's set up to, if it's a game, the mechanics, that it's kind of leaning towards making you feel a very specific way. But you have to also be very clear on what that is, because if you kind of, or if you don't answer to yourself what fantasy you want to deliver on, you're going to end up with a product that's kind of all over the place. What'll happen is, is some of the audio choppy? I hope not. Anyways, what'll happen is that you can end up with a product that's kind of got serving multiple fantasies, and not all of them are mutually exclusive. So to make sure that you start off with a player fantasy, a game fantasy, that is coherent, there are a few different things that you want to think about. For me personally, I like to think about design pillars, the emotional output that I'm expecting from the player, any USPs that may be pre-thought of, where you're like, this is important, or this is some tech that we want to show, or this is a narrative element that we want to show, or this is a cool mechanic. And finally, technical limitations. With technical limitations, that can actually make or break a game sometimes, depending on what sort of experience you're trying to provide. That could be things that your engine is good or is bad at. It could be what your team members are good or bad at, what you have experience in. In terms of board games, it could even just be like, okay, how are we going to package all these components where it's shippable without breaking? There are multiple ways to think about this, but what matters is how concrete of a vision you have, and that is at the crux of what fantasy fulfillment is. You cannot fulfill something you're not certain about. Now, there are two ways to approach this. When you're trying to fulfill a fantasy, you come at it from a narrative end and from a mechanical end. The narrative end is kind of like your wrapper. It's what you're telling the player to feel. The mechanical end is what you're telling the player to do. Now, by themselves, you can get a game with either, but there's no such thing as being on extreme edges of this scale between narrative and mechanic. You're always somewhere in the middle. The amount that you mix these, or the amount of overlap, is actually where different genres will have different conventions, different preferences. Now, for the sake of this talk, let's make something. Let's say that I want to build a board game. And for the sake of this argument, let's say I'm thinking I want big galleon-type trading ships, like old Victorian era stuff, and I want them to be sailing on desert seas instead of actual seas, right? So I've got sort of a visual in mind. Now, with that visual, I'm going to start laying down certain fantasies that I'm expecting to fulfill with this board game, right? I'm saying I want the players to be these sandship traders. They're trying to make the most money they can before the game ends. I want movement to be a big thing because there's this open desert sea. Obviously, the player needs to feel like they're a ship captain. They've got crew and inventory to handle. Maybe I want this element of cooperativeness or competitiveness, depending on how players choose to play. And I really want the world to feel alive, where they don't know what can happen in these vast desert expanses, right? So with that in mind, let's talk about action economy and headspace. So first of all, your action economy is what the player is allowed to do on their turn. Essentially, as a designer, it's what you're allowing them to do, and by omission, what you're not allowing them to do. Think of it this way. the number of tools you put in your player's hands will be directly proportional to the number of unexpected outcomes you can expect from them. As an analogy, let's assume I just give you all this box of Legos and like, build me a submarine. Now, for a lot of you, you're going to be a little bit overwhelmed and just be like, I don't know where to begin. And for a whole bunch of other people, it's just like, all right, let's grab a bunch of stuff and put it together. But if in that case, I'm still going to end up with all kinds of submarines, right? Because I never told anybody what I was expecting. I just said, I want a submarine. And everybody has a different idea of what that is in their head, and also a different idea of what that quality bar is, how much time they should take. And this is why constraints are super important. So when you provide an action or an impetus to a player, you want to impose constraints and limits, not just to the player, but also to yourself with your design. You want to define what you allow, and when you define what you allow, and like I said, what you omit because of that, it starts to kind of give you an idea of what your game is going to be. It's going to define what you need to think about and what you can and can't do in terms of building content or how you build a game. So as an example, it'll define what sort of design considerations you have, whether you want to have this fine scripting control versus maybe running going through bunches of systems and seeing how they interact to make sure nothing wonky happens. The type of content you make, how curated does it need to be versus how generic, and even how much you want to lean into the narrative versus mechanical scale that we discussed earlier, right? On top of this, another really important aspect of your action economy is how your order of execution. So basically, how you do things and what order you do them in, because the order of actions changes your perception of those actions. A great example is this image I have. It's a board game called Discworld Ankh-Morpork. It's based off of a book series. And the gameplay is pretty simple. You have a hand of cards, and you play a card on your turn, right? So the cards look something like this. The first thing you'll notice is that each card has a series of symbols at the top, and you execute these symbols from left to right. What's interesting is that there's a finite number of symbols. There's about 5 or 6, and each is a very precise action. And sure, some of these cards kind of have text that let you do weirder things. But even when you execute those is indicated by this scroll system, symbol, right? And the longer you look at these cards, you'll start to notice patterns, right? You'll notice that this pentagram always comes first. You'll notice that this little play another card always comes at the end. And these are restrictions and constraints that have come in maybe through iteration, maybe just initially, but they're restrictions that say, okay, this symbol always happens at this point, and it cannot happen anywhere else because it could lead to things that maybe the designers didn't want. This order of execution then, or why it's so important, can actually be seen with these 2 cards that I really like. So in the middle, you have 2 characters who are assassins of the Assassins Guild in this world, right? There's Mr. Tiatime, and the other is Dr. Cruces. And yes, that is how you pronounce his name. Mr. Tiatame is a younger gentleman. He's kind of new, very ambitious, trying to make his way in the Assassin's Guild. And Dr. Cruces is the headmaster of the guild, essentially. Now, you'll notice that they almost have the same symbology on top, but the order of execution is different. Mr. Tiatame asks for payment first, and then makes a kill. And the other makes a kill, and then there's payment to be had. Also, Mr. Tiatame then allows you to play another card. So inherently, just by how you play these, it changes how you think about these characters. There's a very good narrative reason for why they behave a certain way, and the way they behave informs how you would think about them from a narrative standpoint. So how does this all apply to our fictional game that we were creating? Well, we've already defined our fantasy. we now have to then define actions based off of this fantasy, right? So this is going to be a big one. But let's say I've defined that I want a desert and I want them to move around. So clearly there's going to be a movement phase or a movement action. That also means I'm going to need a game board. So I'm going to have to think about that. Because I want them to trade and move around and have kind of a place to go, I'm going to want cities or some sort of tile that's a port town where they can trade stuff, which now means I need some way to handle goods and resources and what trading should be. Since I want them to have crew, how do I do crew? Obvious answer to me, at least, was cards. So yeah, you'll have a card that you can that says that this is a crew member. And because exploration is a big thing, and so is making the world feel alive, I want random events to happen based off of where you finish your turn. So that means now I need different tile types and events that match those tile types. You know, anything from a desert tile to an oasis tile. That starts to give me an idea of the monumental task of building these cards and the type of cards I may end up needing. And now, because I'm using exclamation marks, I'm getting excited. I want a persistent sandstorm, and that's a hazard that people have to move around. And maybe pirateering, where you can choose to not trade and just steal from other players and use that to sell at these cities. And finally, I really want ship upgrades, because upgrading stuff is fun and it's cool. And if you can put really fun mechanics into each upgrade that kind of bends the rules in a little way, it feels really empowering for the player, right? So now I have a list of actions and mechanics that I definitely want that relate to the fantasies that I've decided upon, right? And now let's talk about headspace. So headspace is what you are asking the player to keep in mind at all times. And this, from a design standpoint, is kind of a cost incurred to your player's attention span. You have to be aware that this is a cost you are requiring from your players. And you have to then be responsible with how you use that. You can think of headspace, or at least I do, in three phases. There's short-term goals, there's the tracking, and then there are long-term goals. Short-term goals are things like, okay, what can I do in this particular turn? What are known interactions that I have that, if I play this, I can get some additional benefits. Tracking is your game state and thinking about, okay, I've done this. What are other people going to do in response to that? And long-term goals kind of take that a step forward and takes those imagined scenarios and starts making plans based off of what could happen. And there's also meta awareness of, okay, this player behaves a certain way, or in this game currently something is very powerful. This is very clear in turn-based games, but it's also visible, or at least noticeable, in real-time games. So take an FPS, for example. Your short-term goals there would be that you're thinking of your ammunition. You're thinking of how well you're aiming and where you're moving. Your tracking is thinking of cooldowns, if you have any, or where there could be something nearby, checking for pings on the map. And planning is where you're thinking about, okay, I have so much ammunition left. I saw pings in this area. So maybe I need to plan or move to that location in a different way. I know currently that these characters are strong, or I saw someone use this ability and therefore it could be still on cooldown. And those are ways we think about the meta, right? Now, when all this comes together, you get this awesome moment where you're like, yes, I had a master plan, I executed it, and it's just beautiful, right? But, of course, there is a bit of a drawback. The complexity and whether or not a player can handle all that tracking, right? You're asking them to invest so much headspace in so many different avenues. And conventional wisdom will talk about, a player's attention span or how much they can retain a certain amount of information. And while that's true, it's been my experience that value is actually quite elastic. The fixed value is their ability to take a certain amount of information in one go. So it's not really cumulative value. That can actually be elastic and grow to quite an extent. It's the short term. And that's what you need to be aware of, right? If you throw too much at them, obviously they're going to be overwhelmed, much like the Lego example. Too little, they're bored. And this is why layering becomes very important. And it's not an easy task. You got to really figure out how you're going to service a certain amount of information. Now, in board games, this is a bit easier because players have already invested, right? They've spent, what, 2 to 10K on a board game. And at that point, you're like, well, so you're like, okay, I'll read the rules, this big booklet, and figure things out. But for video games, especially free-to-play games, you don't have that. So you've got to not just keep their attention, but layer new mechanics onto it so that they stay interested. And this is a common mechanic, but I think the elasticity portion of it is something to pay attention to. Now, again, how does this apply? So we've got our example here. So I'm thinking about all the different things that we decided to do. And I'm like, wait, I'm asking the player to move, think about where they end up, think about their crew and the sandstorm and also attacking each other. I think ship upgrades is just a bit too much. I'm asking players to keep far too much in mind. So let me get rid of that. If later on I find out that, players can handle it, I can bring it back in. Or maybe it's something I introduce later. But for right now, definitely not something I want to keep, just to be safe. And now, let's talk about downtime. Or wait time. You can choose which word you like. For me, it's always been downtime. So downtime is the space between action execution. Now, as a designer, you will always be calling upon your players' patience, no matter what genre of board game or video game you're making. There will always be a point where you are asking the player to slow down and to not have as much to do as they had before. So the big takeaway for me in this area is to remember that your player count is directly proportional to your wait time with board games. The next layer to this is to know that with video games, based off of the genre you're working with, this rule changes, but the two components are the same. They will be related to each other. It's just how they relate to each other will change. Now, with a lot of action games, a lot of game designers will be familiar with the whole, you have your peaks and then you have a trough to kind of let people cool down. And I've kind of replicated that with amazing art right here. And there's an additional point to when you're de-stressing from a high-octane moment or in a board game, the end of your turn. You're de-stressing, and the amount of time it takes to de-stress is kind of proportional to how much excitement the player was just dealing with. But after that, there's a moment of uncertainty where, all right, I've kind of cooled down, but there's something that's going to come next, and I haven't quite hit switch to boredom. There's a bit of a space there. And it's before you get into the boredom space that you want that the player to have action again. With board games or card games, you want to make sure that the turn rotation happens soon enough. For example, if you're playing, let's say, a tabletop RPG and it's taking 3 people 15 minutes to take their turn cumulatively, and you're waiting 15 minutes just watching them. And sure, the first minute or two you're invested, but then you're just like, yeah, I'll check my phone, and that annoys other people. With video games, if you're just walking down a corridor after a great shooting segment, it's boring unless there's something else to kind of grab your attention. Now, the interesting thing, and this is what I love about video games, is that even here you can bend the rules, and there are different ways to look at the same thing. Now, the uncertainty portion is actually what horror games really take and run with. They extend that uncertainty portion because they're always giving you some sort of subtle feedback. So you may not actively be interacting, but there's enough stuff happening around you to build up the anticipation for what can happen next. And therefore that uncertainty becomes the core of their experience. But yeah, that was just a random aside. Let's go back to our example, shall we? Oh yeah, I was really having fun with PowerPoint animations, so you're going to have to bear with that. Now, downtime. I've decided how I want the player to play their game, right? I want them to take their actions, draw a card, do whatever the card says. and trade and whatnot. But at this point, I'm starting to wonder if the map and if I want the map to kind of change and be dynamic, if that's worth it, right? If I go in and say, hey, I want all these trade cities to kind of change the exchange rates every turn, that could be really long because everybody takes a turn. It goes fairly well, and then at the end of that turn, you're just like, okay, now we have to reset the board and do all this checking with rolling a dice and checking a card or a rule book that tells you what the new exchange rates are. And sure, the first time that'll be fun, but after that, you're just it gets tedious because you're waiting and it's kind of stopping your flow. So maybe I'll decide that I'll change that. I'll have that happen every few turns. So it still happens. I still keep the game state dynamic, but I don't slow down the pace of the game. And when this does happen, it's a bigger event. It's something that you're like, okay, it's part of your long-term vision that, okay, this is going to happen in 2 turns, in 1 turn, and now, and then you plan around that. The other thought I would have is that, okay, I want players to attack each other. But if this, let's say, is a 4-player game, that means when 2 players are having a battle, that's 2 players who are engaged and 2 players who are just watching. And again, their interest in that battle is going to wane over time. So maybe that's not a mechanic worth having. Or maybe I need to figure out a way to make sure that however I design this, it's something that can be done within a shorter time span. And so that's a new rule I can chuck into my little chart or list over here, right? With all this being said, let's move to our final topic. Scaling and variance. So first of all, there's scaling, right? And I personally am a huge believer in that your math confers a certain amount of emotion to your player. And the relationship between the equations and the various scaling options you have in your game will affect how players perceive not just those numbers, but what those numbers are meant to represent, right? Let me give you a few examples here. Let's say I want tension. The first thought that comes to my mind is that I want a oppose stat. Essentially, a stat that either goes one way or the other, and your actions will either move it one way or the other. And obviously, one player wants one side and the other player wants the other. And now there's tension between them as they push and pull to get that skill further on their end. If I wanted a sort of sense of cooperation or consequence, I'd use link stats, where I'm like, okay, if I have this stat go up for every 2 points, something else goes up by 1, right? If it's a cooperative game, then it feels great because my friend did something and I got a benefit because of it. So I'm rooting for him to do something great with that stat. If it's a consequence, maybe it's where I do something powerful, but because I did, the enemy scales up just a bit to match. So I feel great. I won the challenge, but I also know that there's a consequence to it. Finally, let's think about change. And what comes to mind is a deferring scale. And the example I take here is that imagine an RPG where early level you can kill an enemy with, let's say, 10 hits, right? So it's a little grindy, takes a while, um, and it kind of just feels like, yeah, I don't have the power. But if you scale those values for health and attack at different rates, by the end game, you're looking for a value where you can kill an enemy with, let's say, 3 to 4 hits, and all of a sudden, without telling the player anything, they feel powerful because they're doing things more efficiently. And even if you didn't have numbers popping up with like large values, just the fact that something was happening quicker than it used to 5, 6, 7 levels ago is something the player will notice, maybe not actively, but passively, and that changes their perception of the game as a whole. So when you have scaling, you're like defining a set value. But on top of that value, you always want a certain amount of variance because the moment there's uniformity of outcome, it can get boring, especially when you're playing with multiple people. You want variation so that everybody feels like they have a slightly customized experience, right? So when you're thinking about this, the things you want to keep in mind, or some of them at least, is first of all, how much variance do you want? How large should that scale be? Should it be, 1 to 20, like a D20 dice here? Should it be 1 to 4, like a D4? Should it be some other value that makes sense to whatever your game is? Should that variation value scale? Should it be low early on in the game and then become higher? So that, early on it's just, oh, your health is either 3 or 6, and later on it's like anywhere between like 500 and 100? Or do you want it the other way around, where there's a little more variation at level 1, but it kind of gets finer tuned the higher level you go, so everyone gets roughly to the same spot? So once you start asking yourself these questions, you start to define for yourself what acceptable deviance from a mean would be. And that's important because the higher you vary from a mean, the more uncertainty you have in outcome. And that is neither a good or bad thing. It's really dependent on the game you're making and what you're trying to achieve. But that uncertainty that you lead to can fuel a certain type of emotion that you want, or could fuel an emotion you don't want, where people get frustrated, which is stuff that you want to think about. As more examples, I made a quick chart, right? And here I'm just scaling health from level 1 to 25. The values I'm using is a fixed stat, which is 6, plus 1d6, which is a 6-sided dice. So at each level, you get 6 health, and you roll a 6-sided dice for any variant increment to that value, which means that the green line is your average, and then if you're always rolling 6s, you get to the max orange line, and if you're always rolling 1s, you'll be in the teal line. Normally, players will be somewhere in the middle, and generally they'll be closer to the mean over time. But let's just assume the min and max cases, right? Let's just assume you varied more, and there are 2 different sets of means. That can lead to different outcomes, right? So let's take 2 examples. At min, you have 175 health at level 25. At max, you have 300 health at level 25, right? So if an enemy is doing 20 damage, the lower health guy is going to take 8 hits, then he's going to be on a sliver of health, and then he'll take the 9th hit and die. And the beefier character will take 15 hits exactly. And sure, that player feels like he's a tank, because at that point he can weather 6 more attacks than the other. But if I scale up the damage for enemies, let's say it's a boss, and it's doing 150 damage, the low health guy is taking 1 hit, and then he's at a sliver of health yet again, and then he takes another hit and he dies. And the beefy guy takes 1 hit, he's okay, and then he takes another hit, and he dies. Now for the tank player, he's just like, wait, we both died at 2 hits. How am I the tank? And for the weak guy, he's just like, I guess I'm not that weak after all, right? So even though my math kind of, at least fictionally, checks out, the way it's going to be perceived, depending on what damage values I use, will change drastically. So your takeaway here is that no matter how infallible you think your math is, the perception of that math is a whole different ballgame. And that is why you want to keep hitting that math that you've come up with different hypotheticals, to see if there will be changes in how they're perceived. Because that is very important. To this end, just kind of like a minor note, is to remember that that incremental scaling is very different in how it's perceived versus equivalent scaling. Or equivalent scaling is you always get the same value at expected intervals, whereas incremental is that it increases over time. The first, you can end up with like really high numbers or really crazy numbers, and the other is kind of cool. It's much more balanced, but can be boring. So, how does this all apply to our example? So, fun animation time. And now let's get into it. So we've got all our stuff here laid out. And right now I'm just going to focus on one thing, which is the events, right? I know that players are going to draw an event card after they move, depending on what area they drop in. And now I'm setting a rule that says, okay, I want each card to have a success and fail criteria. And depending on that, you get or lose something, right? Each card then has to have a threshold that defines what is going to happen or what you need to do to succeed. And what you have to do to succeed there is roll a d6, right? A six-sided dice. And you would add a certain stat to it. So then I'd ask myself, where do those stats come from? Are they on the ship or somewhere else? So I decide I want them to be part of the crew cards, right? Now, initially, you could think that, okay, I could put numbers on the crew card and say it could be anywhere from +1 to +4, and different crew members would have different variations of stats. But I'm also thinking about headspace and the perception of these things. So why not just keep a flat +2 value? And instead of having to write a number on each card, I can just put a symbol. And if that symbol matches the symbol on the event card, I know that I get a +2 when I roll a d6. Now, based off of that, I know that my thresholds have to be in certain areas, right? If I'm expecting that the easiest task should at least be a 2, that means the player has to roll a 3. That means they have a 50% chance of hitting that. If a hard task needs to be, let's say, a value of 8 or 10, then I can do the math to figure out, okay, what is the percent chance of them hitting that with 1 crew member, 2 crew member, and then see how that feels, right? But essentially, that means my mean value is 3. And that can now allow me to define what the thresholds for different cards are, where I can decide that, okay, this is a hard card, and I need it to have a higher threshold, but the payout is really great, and vice versa. On that note, I can also now decide, because I've suddenly made these stats really important to resolution for events, to ensure that the players get crew members at regular intervals, right? I can just say that I want them to get a crew member every 2 turns. Now I'm going to start thinking about, how do I make that happen? Maybe I can ensure that there are enough event cards that have this payout value, right? Ensure that it happens on success or fail. I can, again, just quickly crunch some numbers and be like, okay, if I have 50 cards in total for events, then I should roughly have about 20 to 25 cards that have this payout so that it happens regularly enough, right? And again, you can then play with those values and then see how it is in the game. And just by doing this, and then doing the same for different mechanics in your game, you end up with a scratch sheet with a bunch of rules, with a bunch of constraints, with your fantasy as a guiding light, and the starting point for you to then go on and make a prototype. You have the rules. The rest of it is just either, if you're making a paper prototype, writing down all the cards manually. If you're making something digitally, then, coding it or getting the assets for it, what have you. So that's it. That's essentially how you would, go from nothing to a fantasy, and then get everything you need, and then build something. So let's recap. Today, we talked about fantasy fulfillment, where you're meeting and setting expectations, or rather setting them first. We talked about the action economy and headspace. The action economy is where you define what you want a player to or not to do. And with headspace, it's how much they can retain. And here you want to remember that the elasticity of how much they can retain in one burst is more important than their overall capacity. That the overall capacity is a value that can grow. Then we talked about downtime, which is what happens when someone has to wait for their next set of actions or the next big moment. Finally, we talked about scaling and variance, where essentially I try to explain how math becomes emotion, because robots, I guess, I don't know. But yeah, that's it. We're done. I hope you had fun. And before we move on, I just want to remind everyone that there's going to be a survey being sent out shortly, and to fill that out so that everybody at IGDC gets more input from you guys and can give you content and talks that are better suited to the things you want to hear about. All right? So thank you. And now I will take questions.
Oh, Hey Tejas, hey everyone. So, folks, if you look at the Q&A tab on the right of your screen, please click that and start sending us your questions. Tejas, I'm going to click those and send them across to you. And yep, that's it for me. All right, let's just test one. Just tell me that you get it. Yeah, we're going to
Uh,
pick one
le-
second. Let's pick a nice one. Here we go. Has it come to you?
yeah, just a second. The
Amazing.
question about the math, I've heard people say that when there is a stat for 90% accuracy, the developers actually make it 99 in the game's code. Is this very common in games like this to bump up the perception? Oh, wait, it went away. Uh, oh, yeah. To bump up the perception of math. Yes and no. So there's actually another talk. I can't remember where it is, but the basic idea is that there are different ways to do this sort of calculation. But the main way to think about it is the perception of it. Just because it's 90% doesn't mean that every ninth time or every 10th time it'll miss. You could very well have a case where it misses 4 times in a row. Mathematically, that's correct because it's still 90%. But for a player, you're just going to be pissed off. You're like, this isn't 90% because I got 4 misses in a row. Explain that. So then you start putting in checks and balances in. So you may not directly put 99% in, but you will put a check that says, okay, if he had a 90% chance and he missed, the next time he uses the same thing, we bump up the chance a bit just so that it doesn't feel unfair. So that if it misses again, we bump it up even more so that it's definitely not going to miss. Little things like that, just so that you handle how players are feeling about the randomness. I hope that answers what you're looking for. Right, next. Once you have the basic actions decided, how do you go about designing the meta of the game, specifically for a card game? So the meta would be decided by a bit of your fantasy, right? Quite often, if you mean meta in a card game sense as Magic the Gathering, for example, um, the developers don't go saying that, or don't go in saying that this is definitely going to be the dominant strategy and this is what we want players to buy. They're generally trying to build a balanced game, and they'll try and get as close to that as possible, and it's usually the players who find ways to break that. The best you can do as the game dev is to make sure that each classification of card has unique identities and unique things that they can do, and what one set can do is offset by another or has something that they can't do, and that there's a bit of a imbalance in terms of capabilities and utilities rather than, oh, this is definitely the most powerful thing that'll go out. Yeah. Next question, please. When is the right time to start playtesting? As soon as possible. So I've got some images on screen, right? I've got those are essentially 2 different games that I had built a while back. As soon as I finished making those cards with like whatever they say, I sat down and played it with a friend and just to figure out what worked and what didn't. And that first playtest was brutal because a lot of stuff broke. So eventually I kind of I made a new batch of cards. It's not pictured here, but actually what I started doing is putting little version 1, version 2, so I could track which iteration that card is from. But yeah, as soon as you have something ready to go, start playtesting. Just get friends together, let them scream at you for how broken it is, and just kind of weather it, internalize the pain, and then make better cards or better gameplay. Is there a way to account for the unknowns when prototyping? Even if the action's complexity downtime is planned beforehand, it is expected that some of these assumptions will be shaken. Accounting for it is very hard. What I like to do is just kind of run through scenarios in my mind. I have a few people that I bounce these things off of because the way they'll look at a problem is very different from the way I do. But at the end of the day, nothing will show you what your unknowns are as good as a playtest. Sure, you can say that, hey, this is an area that unsure about, and I'm fairly certain that whatever happens or whatever will break will be from this area. But there's no way you can go in and say, yes, for sure, this is going to break. And if you did, you'd have fixed it, and then nothing would be broken. And there's never been a game that just came out perfect, right? Let's say if something in your game is not right, and are there any steps to take to pinpoint what the problem is, or is it just intuition? No, they're very precise steps. So there is intuition where some things are just obvious, right? With this card game example that I have on screen, I realized that the rate at which I was giving that shield icon to players was just too low, so it didn't matter. And you notice that my whoever was playing was not using that type of card until they had no choice. And I started noticing even how I was playing. I was like, wait, I'm even not using these cards that often. Other things you can do is to kind of keep track of various problem areas. So I was designing a combat system a while back, and I was just looking at what the damage number was for different classes. And as each turn rolled around, I was just, writing down what everybody rolled, and then mentioning, okay, this was a critical, this was a fail, this happened. And that way I just ended up with a spreadsheet of specific numbers, and I could total it to see, okay, this character class did this much damage in total versus another, and then you can even average it to see, okay, this is the general amount of damage they deal on a per turn basis, and then find out areas. So it's basically knowing what problem areas are, what they could be, and then thinking of avenues to solve them or to calculate them. The main thing is to calculate what you think a problem could be. Do we have time for more questions? Yes, we do. How to start with small games, because I start with small idea and then mess it up by making it bigger and bigger. Yeah, so I've done this a lot. So the best I can tell you is that make sure that your the fantasy you start with is manageable. Don't go in being like, I want all of this, right? Keep it simple. Like even the example I gave here, right, with this sandship thing, that's kind of mid-level. So even if you go with that, the moment you start asking yourself about, okay, how much is the player waiting? How much headspace do they need to do all this? How much wait time do they have between areas? You start realizing where your excesses are and what you want to cut away. And the main thing is to go in being like, look, what can I do to make sure the player is just always invested and is not doing anything that's boring or not as interesting? And sometimes you're biased as the person who made it, which is why you play test to see where people are kind of getting bored. Right. Any digital tools you suggest for brainstorming fluid flow charts that can be changed? Yeah, there's Miro. That's really helpful. Personally, I use a lot of OneNote, and as you can see with these images, I use a lot of notebooks. I don't know, that works for me. But Miro is actually pretty good. It allows a lot of people to come in and has a very tactile feel. So yeah, that should work. Any more? Where are we?
Because I think we're out of time for questions, and we're also out of questions at this point.
Awesome.
I think that there's a bit of a demand for you to start a Udemy course, so maybe that's the next step.
Oh boy, if I can manage the time.
If you can manage them. All right, Tejas, then with that, I think we've come to an end of the session. Thank you so much. As always, it's wonderful to have you as a speaker at IGDC. Folks, if you enjoyed this talk, it really helps us if you would fill that survey. It's only 2 questions, but it lets us get amazing talks for you every year. People like Tejas and others. So please do take the time to fill it out. And these talks are recorded and they will go on YouTube. So if you miss it today, or if your friends want to see it later, if you want to watch it again, it's going to be there. All right. So thank you so much, Tejas. Let's have a big round of, well, I guess you can spam that like button over there. And yep, we'll see you around for the next session, which is a fireside chat with Brenda Romero. And the room will be coming up on floor. All right, Tejas, thank you so much. See you backstage.